There is a word written in Coptic on a piece of papyrus that is approximately 1,700 years old. One word. And that one word, buried in the Egyptian desert since the 4th century, has been called a mistranslation, a metaphor, a theological symbol, and a scandal. Because that one word applied to Mary Magdalene could mean companion. It could mean partner. And in some readings of the Coptic, it could mean wife. Not a theory. Not a modern novel. Not a fringe invention that appeared on the internet last Tuesday. A word in an ancient text. A text that was buried before the Western Roman Empire fell and did not resurface until December 1945, when a farmer in Upper Egypt struck a sealed clay jar and found inside it something the institutional church had spent 15 centuries trying to make sure you never read. The institution that calls this word a mistranslation has never offered an alternative translation of its own. What it has offered is silence. A silence that has lasted 1,700 years, and silence, when it guards power, is its own kind of evidence. But here's what's even more disturbing. The same text that contains that word also contains another passage. A passage that describes Jesus kissing Mary Magdalene on a part of her body. And the manuscript, right at the precise word that would tell you exactly where he kissed her, is physically damaged. The papyrus is torn. The page is worn at its edge. And that word is gone. A hole in the parchment where the most contested sentence in the history of Christianity once existed. Gone. Not suppressed by a censor. Not deliberately scraped clean by a hostile hand. Physically missing. A gap in the ancient papyrus at exactly the moment the text would answer the question. Scholars have been arguing for decades about what that missing word said. Some propose mouth, others say cheek, others say forehead, others say hand. Not one of them can prove it. Because the word is gone. Because at the precise moment the manuscript would settle the debate, the manuscript falls silent. Ask yourself, is that a coincidence? What if I told you that this document was buried not because it was heretical, but because it was dangerous? Not because it was untrue, but because if enough people read what it said, an entire structure of institutional authority would have been forced to answer a question it had spent centuries refusing to ask. Not a question about theology. Not a question about sin. A question about who was closest to Jesus. About who held the highest spiritual authority. About what that person's name was. That document exists. It is real. It is 1,700 years old. It was discovered in December of 1945 in the Egyptian desert. It sits today in the Coptic Museum in Cairo. Its name is the Gospel of Philip. And what it says about Mary Magdalene is something the institutional church has been working to keep from you since the 4th century AD. By the end of this video, you are going to know what it actually says. You are going to understand the word at the center of this entire controversy, what it means in the original Coptic, what the church insists it means, and why those two readings are not the same thing. You are going to understand what the bridal chamber sacrament is, and why it has nothing to do with the ordinary marriage the Vatican claims is absent from this text. You are going to learn how one man, in one sermon, on September 14th of the year, 591 AD, turned the most important woman in the New Testament into a prostitute. And you are going to discover why, in June of 2016, the Vatican itself quietly reversed a position it had defended for 1,400 years, and what it still refuses to explain. You are going to understand why 3 completely separate ancient texts, all of them excluded from the canon, all of them suppressed or buried or forgotten, say the exact same thing about the exact same woman. If you ever felt that the version of Mary Magdalene the church handed you was incomplete, you were right. She funded the ministry out of her own resources. She stood at the cross when every male disciple had fled. and she was the first witness of the resurrection in all four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. All four. The most important moment in Christian history, witnessed first by a woman. And all four of the Gospel writers the Vatican holds as authoritative agree on this. Not Peter, not the 12, her. And then the Church spent 1,400 years calling her a prostitute. Something is missing. And what is missing is precisely what a forbidden gospel, preserved for 1,578 years in a sealed clay jar in the Egyptian desert. Subscribe to this channel and activate the bell so you do not miss any revelation. These truths are reaching people who are ready to receive them. And the fact that you are here right now, watching this, is not a coincidence. Now, before we open the Gospel of Philip, there is something you need to understand first, because this story does not begin with Gnostics. It does not begin with heretics or hidden sects or traditions operating outside the Church. It begins inside Orthodoxy itself. In the 3rd century AD, a bishop of Rome, a church father, not a dissident, not an outsider, one of the most orthodox theological authorities of his generation, wrote a commentary on the Song of Songs. And in that commentary, he gave Mary Magdalene a title. He called her Apostola Apostolorum, the Apostle to the Apostles, because she was the one commissioned by the risen Jesus to announce his resurrection to the 11 remaining disciples. The most important announcement in the history of Christianity. Not entrusted to Peter, not given to the 12, given to her. That bishop was Hippolytus of Rome. He lived from approximately 170 to 235 AD. He was not a Gnostic. He was not a rebel. He was as orthodox as the early church produced. And he arrived at that title not through some secret tradition, not through a text the church had forbidden. He arrived at it through the 4 canonical Gospels themselves, through the testimony of Matthew and Mark and Luke and John. He saw what was plainly there. She was the first. She was the one Jesus sent to tell the others, and he named her accordingly. And then, centuries later, the institutional church called her a prostitute. Why would a church that honored her enough to carry that title need to spend 1,400 years burying it? What was it about Mary Magdalene, about what the earliest texts said about her? About the word the Gospel of Philip used to describe her relationship to Jesus that required her complete erasure? What were they afraid you would find? The answer is in one word, written in Coptic, on a piece of papyrus that sat underground for 1,578 years. The word is koinonos, and what they have been telling you it does not mean is exactly where this story begins. December 1945, Upper Egypt. A man named Muhammad Ali al-Saman and his brothers are working at the base of a cliff called Jabal al-Tarif, rising from the desert floor approximately 11 kilometers northeast of the town of Nag Hammadi. They have come to dig for sabak, a natural fertilizer found in the soft soil at the foot of the cliff. His mattock strikes something hard in the ground. He digs around it. What he uncovers is a sealed earthenware jar, standing approximately 1 meter tall. He hesitates. Local tradition holds that such jars sometimes contain dangerous spirits, but they also sometimes contain gold. He raises the mattock and breaks it open. Inside are 13 leather-bound papyrus codices, ancient books. He does not know what language they are in. He does not know what they say. Some pages are burned that night as kindling. Others are sold to dealers in Cairo. Most eventually make their way into the hands of scholars. And all of them, over the following years, arrive at the Coptic Museum in Cairo, where they reside today. Inside those 13 codices are 52 texts, mostly written in Sahidic Coptic, translated from Greek originals, copied by hand in the mid to late 4th century AD. 52 texts that were deliberately sealed in that jar and buried in the earth because someone had decided the world should not be allowed to read them. Inside one of those codices, the second one, the one scholars catalogue as Codex II, is a text called the Gospel of Philip. The first thing you need to understand about the Gospel of Philip is what it is not. It is not a narrative gospel. It is not a story of Jesus' life in the way that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John tell that story. There is no account of his birth in this text, no account of his ministry, no account of his death. The Gospel of Philip does not tell you what Jesus did. It tells you what his teaching meant. It is a collection of theological reflections organized around 5 sacred rites that the Valentinian tradition understood as the complete architecture of salvation: baptism, chrism, Eucharist, redemption, and the bridal chamber, which is the highest and most mysterious of the 5, and which we will examine in full before this video is finished. It was composed originally in Greek, probably in Syria, in the late 2nd or 3rd century AD. The surviving Coptic manuscript dates to the mid to late 4th century. The first modern English translation was produced by a scholar named Wesley W. Eisenberg in 1962, revised in 1996, and published in James M. Robinson's landmark collection, the Nag Hammadi Library in English, in 1977. The most recent complete scholarly edition was edited by the late Marvin W. Meyer, Grise professor at Chapman University, who died in 2012, and published as the Nag Hammadi Scriptures by Harper One in 2007. That is what the Gospel of Philip is. Now let's understand the tradition it came from. The tradition behind this text was founded by a man named Valentinus. He was born in Egypt, educated in Alexandria, and active in Rome from approximately 136 to 165 AD. By the accounts of his contemporaries and opponents, he was the most intellectually sophisticated of all the Gnostic teachers of the 2nd century. He came so close to becoming Bishop of Rome that his near election was cited in church debates about authority and succession for decades afterward. He nearly became the head of the Christian world. He did not, and what he taught instead became the foundation that the Gospel of Philip was built on. Valentinus taught that the highest God was unknowable, beyond all categories, beyond all naming. From this unknowable source flowed a series of divined pairs, what his school called aeons, 30 of them, arranged in 15 pairs, each one an emanation of the divine fullness. He taught that human beings carried divine sparks, trapped inside matter, and he taught that salvation came not through institutional sacraments controlled by clergy, but through gnosis, through direct personal knowledge of one's own divine origin. No bishop required, no church required. Direct knowledge, personal transformation. Around 180 AD, a bishop in what is now southern France decided this could not stand. That bishop was Irenaeus of Lyon. Born around 130 AD, he wrote a 5-volume work called Adversus Heresies, Against Heresies, devoted largely to dismantling Valentinian theology argument by argument, passage by passage. He described the tradition in detail, quoted from its texts, and condemned it. According to Irenaeus, the Valentinian Gospels and teachings were fabrications designed to deceive Christians into abandoning true faith. He is the earliest known writer to directly engage and condemn the theological tradition behind the Gospel of Philip. The institutional assault on this text had begun before the 3rd century even started. But here is something you need to hear before we go further, because the popular account of how the Gnostic Gospels were suppressed contains a significant factual error. You may have been told that Constantine eliminated the Gnostic Gospels at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, that he gathered 300 bishops, and they voted on which scriptures to accept and which to destroy. That story is repeated everywhere. It is not history. The Council of Nicaea addressed one question, the Arian controversy, whether the Son of God was co-eternal with the Father, or was himself a created being. The biblical canon was not on the council's agenda. No gospel was destroyed by imperial decree at that council. Only 2 of approximately 300 bishops refused to sign the Nicene Creed. The vote on Christ's divinity was not close. The Gospel of Philip was not buried because of Constantine. It was buried because of a letter written 42 years later. Easter 367 AD. Athanasius of Alexandria, born approximately 296 AD, was approximately 71 years old. He had been Bishop of Alexandria for decades, exiled 5 times by emperors who opposed him, and had returned from every exile. In his 39th festal letter, written to the churches under his authority, he did something no Christian leader had ever done in writing before. He listed the exact 27 books he declared to constitute the New Testament, the same 27 books in your Bible today. His words were absolute. According to Athanasius, these are the springs of salvation. And his instruction was equally final: let no one add to them, nor take away from them anything. The monks of the Pachomian monastery at Chenoboskion, near Nag Hammadi, received that letter. Their library contained texts Athanasius had just declared forbidden. They faced a choice between compliance and preservation. They chose preservation. They sealed their books in a clay jar. They buried the jar at the base of the Jabal al-Tarif cliff. They walked away, and the Gospel of Philip sat in the dark for 1,578 years, until December 1945, when a mattock came down in the desert and the earth finally gave it back. Tell me in the comments. Before today, had you ever heard of the Gospel of Philip? I am genuinely fascinated to know how much true seekers of truth like you already know. Write your country and your answer. Because what this text actually says about Mary Magdalene, and the word it uses to describe her relationship to Jesus, is exactly where we are going next. Now we open the text. Now we read what the Gospel of Philip actually says about Mary Magdalene. There are 2 separate passages in this document that mention her. 2 passages, both using the same word to describe her relationship to Jesus. They reinforce each other. The translation used here is by Wesley W. Eisenberg, the standard scholarly translation, published in James M. Robinson's Nag Hammadi Library in English. The passage reads as follows: "And the companion of the Saviour is Mary Magdalene. Christ loved her more than all the disciples, and used to kiss her often on her." Here the manuscript is physically damaged. The word that tells you exactly where he kissed her is missing. The papyrus is worn and torn at the foot of the page at precisely that point. The passage continues without it. The rest of the disciples were offended by it and expressed disapproval. They said to him, "Why do you love her more than all of us?" Read that carefully. Christ loved her more than all the disciples. He kissed her, repeatedly, on a part of her body the text names, but the manuscript no longer preserves. The other disciples were not merely uncomfortable. They were offended enough to confront him directly and demand an explanation. Why does she receive something from you that we do not? That is not the reaction of men observing a casual friendship. That is the reaction of men who felt outranked. The text does not record what Jesus answered, but it records that they asked the question. And it records that the relationship was significant enough to produce open conflict among those who were closest to him. Now the second passage, from a different section of the same document. There were 3 who always walked with the Lord: Mary, his mother, and her sister, and Magdalene, the one who was called his companion. His sister and his mother and his companion were each a Mary. She is named the companion twice in this text, not in one place, in 2 separate passages, in 2 different sections of the same document, and both times the word used is koinonos. That word is at the center of everything. Koinonos is a Greek loanword that the author of the Gospel of Philip imported into his Coptic text. Its range of meanings includes associate, companion, partner, one who shares in something with another. Scholars who argue against the marriage reading point out, correctly, that the sharing this word describes can take many forms, ranging from a common enterprise or experience to a shared business relationship. Koinonos does not exclusively mean spouse. It can mean colleague. It can mean partner in ministry. And the Church's position, the position the title of this video calls a mistranslation, is that this is exactly what the word means here. Companion in the spiritual sense. Nothing more. But here's what's fascinating. The Gospel of Philip does not only use koinonos, when the author of this text means wife in the ordinary human sense, he uses different words. The standard Coptic word for wife, which scholars render as shaim, appears in other passages in this same document, in contexts where people who are plainly in ordinary marriages are being described. A second Coptic term, hotre, an Egyptian origin word with similar domestic meaning, also appears in the text. The author knew these words. He used them where they belonged, and when he described Mary Magdalene's relationship to Jesus, he set both of them aside and chose koinonos instead. A word he specifically reserved for a relationship he understood as categorically different from ordinary marriage. This is not a translation error. This is a deliberate choice made by an author who had multiple words available and used the precise one he intended. According to Dr. Elaine Pagels, Harrington Spear Payne Professor of Religion Emerita at Princeton University, the Gnostic Gospels offer a vision of Christianity where spiritual authority derives from personal experience of the divine, not from institutional hierarchy. Mary Magdalene's role across these texts is consistently that of the primary recipient of spiritual knowledge. The word koinonos does not diminish that position. It names it. Now the lacuna. Let's be precise about what is missing and what is not. The papyrus is damaged at the foot of the page, and the word identifying where Jesus kissed Mary Magdalene has not survived. Not erased by a censor, not deliberately removed, physically deteriorated, the way ancient papyrus decays at its edges after 1700 years. Over the decades, scholars have proposed 4 different reconstructions for the missing word. Mouth, which was popularized far beyond any manuscript evidence by Dan Brown's novel The Da Vinci Code in 2003. Cheek, forehead, and hand. According to Bart Ehrman, James A. Gray, Distinguished Professor of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, the lacuna is genuine, and the body part cannot be determined from the surviving manuscript. None of the 4 proposals can be confirmed, not one. But here is what the undamaged text says clearly, without any gap at all. He kissed her often. The disciples were offended. He loved her more than all of them. That much survived. And what it tells you is that the relationship described in this text was intimate enough that it became a source of conflict among those closest to Jesus. The disciples asked the question because something real was in front of them. And the something real had a name. Now consider what a kiss means in this theology. Because the Gospel of Philip does not leave that question open, it contains another passage, separate from the Mary Magdalene material, that explains what kissing represents in the Valentinian understanding. For it is by a kiss that the perfect conceive and give birth. For this reason, we also kiss one another. We receive conception from the grace which is in one another. A kiss, in this system, is an act of transmission. It is how divine knowledge and grace pass from one person to another. It is the sacramental transfer of the Spirit. And this was not a Gnostic invention. The Orthodox early Church commanded this practice explicitly. Paul ordered the holy kiss in his letter to the Romans. He repeated the command in 1 Corinthians, in 2 Corinthians, in 1 Thessalonians. The author of 1 Peter gave the same instruction a 5th time. 5 canonical letters, 5 orthodox commands to practice the holy kiss as a living Christian rite. A kiss was how the Spirit moved. In the Gospel of Philip, Jesus kissing Mary Magdalene is not romantic evidence. It is evidence of what he was transmitting to her. Something the disciples standing nearby could see happening, but could not receive themselves. One more thing needs to be stated before we proceed. You may have heard about a Coptic papyrus fragment announced in September 2012 that contained the words Jesus said to them, "My wife." It was presented at an academic congress in Rome by Karen L. King of Harvard Divinity School. By June 2016, Dr. King had publicly acknowledged that the evidence pointed overwhelmingly to a modern forgery. It was not ancient. It proved nothing about the historical Jesus. The Gospel of Philip is 1700 years old. No serious scholar has ever disputed that. It is not that fragment. It is something far older, far more carefully studied, and far more difficult to dismiss. Jean-Yves Leloup, a French Orthodox priest, trained at the Sorbonne and the Saint Sergius Institute, and the founder of the Institut Saint-Denis l'Areopagite, who published his full translation of the Gospel of Philip through Inner Traditions in 2004. For Leloup, koinonos names something elevated above ordinary marriage, not equivalent to it, a sacramental partnership, the highest form of union the Valentinian tradition recognized. And if that reading is correct, then what the institutional church buried in that clay jar was not a claim about a human relationship. It was a theology in which a woman held the position of supreme spiritual authority. And that theology has a name, too. It is the bridal chamber. And it is exactly where we are going next. The Gospel of Philip does not present the bridal chamber as one option among many. It presents it as the highest of all sacred rites, as what every other sacrament in the text is building toward. The passage makes the hierarchy explicit. The Lord did everything in a mystery, a baptism and a chrism and a Eucharist and a redemption and a bridal chamber, 5 mysteries, 5 sacraments, ascending in a deliberate order, from the familiar to the supreme. At the top, not baptism, not the Eucharist you may have grown up receiving. The bridal chamber. Now let's understand what the bridal chamber actually is. Because its name is misleading. The Greek word is nymphon, the Coptic is pastos. And in Valentinian theology, the bridal chamber is not a ceremony about human marriage. It is a mystical initiation, available only to those the Valentinian tradition called pneumatics, spirit-bearers, those who had attained the spiritual development to receive it. In Valentinian cosmology, the unknowable highest God originally existed in divine wholeness, but that wholeness was fractured through what the tradition calls the error of Sophia, the lowest divine emanation, and the material world came into being. Human beings now carry divine sparks trapped inside matter, separated from their divine counterpart. The bridal chamber is the reversal of that separation, the reunion of the spiritual soul, which the text calls the bride, with its divine source, which the text calls the groom. Not a human wedding ceremony, a cosmic restoration of original wholeness. The Gospel of Philip describes this in a passage that could not be more explicit. Those who are united in the bridal chamber will no longer be separated. Eve separated from Adam because it was not in the bridal chamber that she united with him. The soul of Adam came into being by means of a breath. The partner given to him is the Spirit. His mother is the thing that was given to him. His soul was taken from him and replaced by the Spirit. When he was united to the Spirit, he spoke words incomprehensible to the powers. They envied him. And from another passage in the same text, a bridal chamber is not for the animals, nor is it for the slaves, nor for defiled women, but it is for free men and virgins. This rite is not for everyone. It cannot be administered by the church. It cannot be dispensed by a priest at a communion rail. The Valentinian system holds that the bridal chamber is an interior event, a reunion of the soul with its divine source, that no institution can mediate and no bishop can control. The institution has no role in it. The institution has no authority over it. Do you grasp what that means? If the highest form of salvation is accessible directly, personally, without clergy, without hierarchy, without the church as intermediary, then the entire structure of ecclesiastical power has nothing to offer. It cannot deliver what matters most. Now place koinonos back inside this framework. If the bridal chamber is the supreme sacrament, the restoration of divine wholeness that surpasses all ordinary human relationship, then what does it mean that the figure called koinonos always walked with him, was loved more than all the others, and received the kiss of spiritual transmission from him repeatedly? She is not described in the domestic sense of a wife. She is described in the sacramental sense of the one in closest proximity to the source of the highest mystery. The one with access the others were denied. This is why the disciples were offended, not because of romance, because of authority, because she had something they did not, and they asked him to explain it directly. Why her more than us? The Gospel of Philip provides the answer through its entire structure, not in a single sentence, in the totality of what the bridal chamber means and who stands nearest to it. We are living in days when these truths are clawing their way back into the light. Subscribe to this channel and activate the bell so you do not miss a single revelation. What we are about to look at is a second ancient text, discovered half a century before Nag Hammadi, in an entirely different tradition, saying something remarkably similar about the same woman. Subscribe now, and let's keep going. The Gospel of Philip is not alone. In January 1896, a German diplomat named Karl Reinhardt purchased an ancient Coptic papyrus codex from a dealer in Cairo. The manuscript is now held in Berlin, catalogued as Papyrus Berlinensis 8502. It is a 5th century Sahidic Coptic text. Pages 1 through 6 are missing from the beginning. Pages 11 through 14 are missing from the middle. But 2 Greek fragments of the same document, catalogued as P. Ryle 463 and P. Oxy 3525, confirm that the original was composed in the 2nd century A.D. The text is called the Gospel of Mary. In the pages that survive, the risen Jesus has already departed. The disciples are left behind in grief and fear. Mary Magdalene rises and speaks to them. Peter, hearing what she says, asks her to share the secret teachings the Savior gave her privately. She does. And then, when she has finished, Peter turns on her. Did he really speak privately with a woman and not openly to us? Are we to turn about and all listen to her? Did he prefer her to us? Another disciple, Levi, answers him, Peter, you have always been hot-tempered. If the Savior made her worthy, who are you indeed to reject her? Surely the Savior knows her very well. That is why he loved her more than us. That is why he loved her more than us. Read those words again. This is not the Gospel of Philip. This is a completely separate text, a different tradition, a different community of origin, discovered in a different country, in a different century, and it is saying exactly the same thing about Mary Magdalene. She was the one he loved more. She received privately what the others didn't receive, and even among the disciples, that was already understood. There is a third text. The Pistis Sophia is preserved in the Askew Codex, held in the British Library as Additional Manuscript 5114. In its pages, the risen Jesus has been teaching the disciples continuously for 11 years on the Mount of Olives. The disciples ask him 46 questions across the full dialogue of the text. Mary Magdalene asks 39 of them, and Jesus addresses her directly in words the text has preserved for nearly 1700 years. Mary, thou blessed one, whom I will perfect in all the mysteries. Speak openly, thou whose heart is more directed to the kingdom of heaven than all thy brothers. 3 texts: the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary, the Pistis Sophia. 3 completely separate ancient documents, composed in different eras, preserved through entirely different channels, recovered across a span of 50 years in different parts of the world. All 3 elevate Mary Magdalene above the male disciples. All 3 place her closest to the source of divine knowledge. All 3 say the same thing. What they reveal together is not a claim about whether Jesus was married. They reveal a form of early Christianity that existed before the institutional church consolidated its authority, in which the primary recipient of spiritual transmission was a woman. Not subordinate, not peripheral, not a footnote. The primary vessel of the highest knowledge. A spiritual equal is more dangerous to a hierarchical institution than a wife could ever be. A wife can be named and placed. A wife can be acknowledged and given a domestic category that leaves the power structure intact. But a figure elevated by 3 independent ancient texts as the supreme recipient of the highest sacrament, positioned above Peter, above the 12, above the entire male chain of transmission, the institutional church claims as its foundation, cannot be accommodated. She has to be explained away. She has to be renamed. She has to be buried. And for 1,578 years, she was. 2 weapons were used against Mary Magdalene. One against the texts that elevated her. One against the woman herself. Both were deployed by institutional authority. Both are documented in the historical record. Both can be traced to a specific man, a specific document, and specific words that survived. The first weapon was a letter. You already heard the story of Athanasius's 39th festal letter. But to understand the full scope of what was done to Mary Magdalene, you need to see it not as a single event, but as the beginning of a deliberate campaign. Athanasius issued his letter at Easter 367 AD. He was approximately 71 years old. He had been exiled 5 times for his theological convictions and had returned each time. His letter named the exact 27 books of the New Testament and issued an absolute command. Let no one add to them, nor take away from them anything. The texts that elevated Mary Magdalene above the male disciples were not merely questioned. They were placed outside the sacred boundary, outside what any Christian community was permitted to hold. And Athanasius was not speaking as a private theologian. He was the most powerful bishop in the Eastern Church, operating with the authority of an increasingly Christianized Roman state. 13 years later, that state authority became law. On February 27th, 380 AD, Emperors Theodosius I, Gratian, and Valentinian II issued the Edict of Thessalonica. It was the first Roman law to formally require adherence to Nicene Christianity, and the first to criminalize theological dissent. Subsequent edicts in the Theodosian Code banned Arians, Manichaeans, and others by name. The world Athanasius had outlined through his letter, a world with one acceptable canon and all alternatives outside it, became, by imperial decree, a world where holding alternatives was not merely wrong but illegal. Communities preserving texts like the Gospel of Philip were no longer simply heterodox. They were in violation of Roman law. The texts could be buried. And they were. But there was a problem. The woman those texts elevated still appeared in the 4 canonical Gospels the very same institution had declared sacred. She still funded the ministry. She still stood at the cross when every male disciple had fled. She was still named in all 4 canonical Gospels as the first witness of the resurrection. Athanasius could bury the Gospel of Philip. He could not bury Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, she was still there, still first, still present, still the one the risen Jesus commissioned to announce his resurrection to the 11. The apostle to the apostles was not going to disappear on her own. something else was required. September 14th, 591 A.D. In Rome, Pope Gregory I, who would later receive the title the Great, preached a sermon that would define Western Christianity's understanding of Mary Magdalene for the next 1,400 years. The sermon was Homily 33, and in it he collapsed three separate women into a single composite identity in the space of one paragraph. He merged Mary Magdalene, who funded the ministry and was the first witness of the resurrection, with Mary of Bethany, the contemplative sister of Lazarus, mentioned in John's Gospel, and with the unnamed sinful woman of Luke chapter 7, verses 36 through 50. Three women, named or described in three completely separate gospel passages, given three distinct roles in the canonical narrative, fused into one, in his own words, preserved in Homily 33. She, whom Luke calls the sinful woman, whom John calls Mary, we believe to be the Mary from whom 7 devils were ejected. One sentence, one man, one sermon on one September afternoon in Rome. And the apostle to the apostles became, for the next 14 centuries in the Western Church, a prostitute. The woman personally commissioned by the risen Jesus to carry the most important announcement in the history of Christianity. The woman honored by name in all 4 canonical Gospels at the resurrection. The woman whom the Orthodox bishop Hippolytus of Rome had called Apostola Apostolorum in the 3rd century, working directly from the canonical record. That woman became, through Gregory's conflation, a symbol of sexual sin and moral failure. And that composite identity dominated Western Christian art, Western theology, Western devotion, and Western institutional teaching for 1,400 years. The texts were buried underground. The woman was buried in moral shame. The pattern was complete. Why? Not because the historical record required it, not because the canonical Gospels suggested it, not because any document earlier than Gregory's sermon supported the conflation. Because of power. According to Dr. Elaine Pagels, Harrington Spear Payne Professor of Religion Emerita at Princeton University, the Gnostic Gospels describe a form of Christianity in which spiritual authority derives from personal experience of the divine, not from institutional hierarchy, a church that grounds its entire claim to legitimacy in the doctrine of apostolic succession, in the idea that spiritual authority flows from Jesus through Peter, through an unbroken chain of ordained men, cannot accommodate a tradition in which the primary holder of spiritual transmission is a woman who received it directly. Without mediation, without institution, without clergy as intermediary. The texts had to go, and Mary Magdalene, as the canonical Gospels still showed her, had to be reinterpreted as something that would neutralize the question she raised simply by being present in the record. Now, the title of this video makes a specific claim that needs to be addressed honestly. No pope has ever issued a formal decree calling the Gospel of Philip a mistranslation. There is no council document, no papal bull, no official church statement that directly engages with the word koinonos and declares it incorrectly rendered. What the institutional church has done is define the Gospel of Philip as outside the canon through the process Athanasius initiated in 367 AD, and never formally engage with what the text says. The mistranslation argument belongs to the scholarly debate over what koinonos means in Coptic, not to a Vatican document. The Church's position on the Gospel of Philip is not a stated refutation. It is a practiced silence, and silence, as we have established, is its own kind of answer. Here is the final confirmation that what Gregory I did in 591 was a political choice and not a theological requirement. The Eastern Orthodox Church never accepted it. The Eastern Christian tradition, which preserved the ancient faith through different channels than Rome, never merged Mary Magdalene with Mary of Bethany or with the sinful woman of Luke 7. The three women in the Eastern tradition remained three separate women, exactly as the canonical Gospels present them. The Eastern Church preserved her title as the Apostle to the Apostles, the title the canonical record supports, and Hippolytus of Rome had named in the 3rd century. No Eastern council merged the three women. No Eastern father called her a prostitute. One church, one canonical Gospel record, two traditions. One called her a prostitute for 1,400 years. One never did. That divergence is not theological. You cannot derive two opposite conclusions from the same text unless one of those conclusions is motivated by something other than what the text says. What motivates the Western conclusion is not Scripture. It is the institutional need to explain away a figure the suppressed texts elevated to the highest spiritual position in early Christianity. The question is why that position could not be allowed to stand. The answer has been in this text all along. December 1945, Upper Egypt. A mattock comes down in the desert floor and strikes a clay jar that has been sitting in darkness for 1,578 years. Inside that jar, among 13 leather-bound codices containing 52 ancient texts, is the Gospel of Philip. Composed in the late 2nd or 3rd century AD, copied onto papyrus in the 4th century, sealed in that jar at the base of the Jabal al-Tarif cliff by monks who chose preservation over compliance when the most powerful bishop in the Eastern Church commanded them to surrender everything that lay outside the newly defined canon. Those monks could not have known what they were doing. They did not know they were preserving a question. A question the institutional church would one day be forced to either answer or pretend, across 15 centuries of practiced silence, had never been asked. The question written into a single word on a single page of a single forbidden text. And in December 1945, after 1,578 years of darkness, that question came back into the light. The institution had used two weapons to bury it: a letter from a bishop in 367 AD to put the texts outside the canon, a sermon from a pope in 591 AD to put the woman herself outside the realm of spiritual authority. One weapon directed at the documents, one directed at the person those documents described, and in December 1945, after 15 centuries of sustained institutional effort, a clay jar broke in the desert and both weapons failed. The Nag Hammadi codices eventually reached the Coptic Museum in Cairo. The first complete English translation of the entire library was the work of James M. Robinson, Professor Emeritus of Religion at Claremont Graduate University, published in 1977. That edition, the first to make all 52 texts available to English-speaking readers in one volume, introduced the word koinonos to the modern world. The Gospel of Philip within it was translated by Wesley W. Eisenberg, whose work of 1962, revised in 1996, remains the standard scholarly text. In 2007, the late Marvin W., Maya Grizzett Professor at Chapman University, who died in 2012, edited the most recent comprehensive edition of all the Nag Hammadi texts, under the title The Nag Hammadi Scriptures, published by Harper One, bringing the full weight of updated scholarship to bear on what the ancient texts said, and the scholar who has done more than perhaps any other to bring the significance of these texts to a wider audience is Karen L. King, who holds the Hollis Professor of Divinity Chair at Harvard Divinity School. The Hollis Chair is the oldest endowed professorship in the United States, established in 1721. Karen L. King was the first woman to hold it. The word came back, and in 2016, so did something else. On June 10, 2016, Pope Francis signed a decree through the Congregation for Divine Worship. Mary Magdalene's feast day, on July 22nd, was elevated to the same liturgical rank as the feast days of the 12 male apostles. The new preface composed for her feast uses a title that the Orthodox bishop Hippolytus of Rome first gave her in the 3rd century, working from the canonical Gospels alone. Apostolorum Apostola, Apostle to the Apostles, they restored her title. 1,425 years after Gregory I took it. But here is what they have not done. They have not acknowledged the Gospel of Philip. They have not addressed the word koinonos. They have not explained what it means that 3 separate ancient texts, all of them excluded from the canon, all of them suppressed, buried, or lost, independently describe her as the primary recipient of spiritual transmission above the male disciples. They restored the title and left the question in the jar. They said Apostola Apostolorum and declined to say what the suppressed text says about why. The Gospel of Philip is still in the Coptic Museum in Cairo. The word koinonos is still on the page where it was always written. 1,700 years old, still waiting for the institutional answer that has never come. And that is exactly why you are here. You uncovered how a 1,700-year-old text was sealed in a clay jar in the Egyptian desert and left there for 1,578 years, hidden by monks who chose preservation over compliance when a bishop commanded them to surrender everything outside the canon. You learned the single word, koinonos, that the author of the Gospel of Philip chose for Mary Magdalene, even though he had a perfectly ordinary word for wife, and deliberately set it aside. You discovered that the kiss the manuscript is physically damaged at was not romance. It was initiation. It was the transmission of grace, the sacramental act, the Valentinian tradition understood as how divine knowledge passes between souls. You understood what the bridal chamber really means, and why a theology of direct divine access, one that needs no bishop and no institution, was the theology the Church could not allow to survive. You learned that the Eastern Orthodox Church, across 14 centuries of Western silence, never once called her a prostitute, and never merged the 3 women Gregory I collapsed into one, which tells you everything about whether what was done to her was theology or politics. And you witnessed 3 completely separate ancient texts, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary, and the Pistis Sophia, discovered in different places across a span of 50 years, saying the same thing about the same woman. It is not coincidence that you are watching this now. These truths do not reach everyone. They reach people who are prepared to receive them. People who have felt, in some part of themselves they could not fully explain, that the version of this history they were given was incomplete. If that is you, then what you encountered in this video is not a theory. It is a record. Ancient, documented. And finally, after 1,578 years, available to you. Subscribe to this channel and activate the bell so you do not miss any revelation. Tell me in the comments, from where are you watching this? I am genuinely fascinated to know how far these truths are traveling, and your answer can open the eyes of others who are just beginning to ask these questions. I have prepared a resource for you, available in the pinned comment below this video, that goes deeper into what the suppressed texts say. And in the next video, we will examine another ancient text that takes the question raised by the Gospel of Philip and pushes it into territory the institution has been even more determined to suppress. Do not miss it. Subscribe now. The word is koinonos. The author of the Gospel of Philip had a word for wife and chose not to use it. He chose a different word, a word that means something the Church spent 1,700 years trying to ensure you never heard. And the question the Gospel of Philip left open the day it was sealed in a clay jar in the Egyptian desert, the question that 1,578 years of buried papyrus and 1,425 years of papal silence have never answered, is not whether she was his wife. It is why they were so afraid of what